It's a real pleasure to be here to talk to you guys. I made the journey today from the big metropolis of concrete, Washington, where I spend part of my time. And I was actually fortunate to fly this morning because I haven't been flying all that much lately. The title of this program refers to the fact that for the last 7 or 8 years I've been working almost exclusively in black and white. And you're going to see some color stuff here, but predominantly, especially towards the end, it's been black and white, mostly arising out of my personal hang-ups about color and what we see when we're looking at mountain landscapes. And you know, a lot of my stuff's in the wintertime, so it's basically light and dark or black and white to start with. And I was second guessing myself for a long time, but I'm really attracted to black and white, and so I just kind of gradually made the shift. It's not exclusive by any means, and I'm always shooting in what's called raw mode, so it's just a few clicks to switch back and forth. This image is from the Coast Mountains of British Columbia, Mount Waddington, 13,000 plus up there, about 200 miles north of Vancouver, 250 miles. This was shot for a video I did for a movie, the Fred Beckey movie, Dirtbag. Maybe some of you have seen it. I was up there to shoot video, but you can't be in a spot like this without taking a few stills from time to time. Okay, well, I believe that great things come from obsession, and it can go either way. It can go good or evil. I was fortunate that my obsession, I think, was for good. And it started out at a young age, probably when I should have been studying. Instead, I was sitting in class drawing stuff like this. Back then, I thought I was going to be a fighter pilot in the Air Force, bombing everything. And that's all I thought about, day in, day out. And in the 3rd grade, I was found to be quite markedly nearsighted. So my mom was like, darn it, no Air Force for you. And but that never stopped my interest in flying, and I turned to more pastoral, types of flying. And but I was also interested in a lot of things. I was interested in mountains and glaciers even then. And I know there's some scientists in the room here, but here I was in the 4th grade doing scholarly work on glaciers way back when. There's a little clue to some other obsessions in this drawing that my mother saved, fortunately for me. But I was really obsessed with the Titanic. And so I made sure to have a sinking ship in my little diagram. I did a presentation not long ago where I had no photographs of my airplane, and so I had a lot of questions about it. And so it's back in. It is something that I built myself from a kit over a period of 9 years. This is about 2 or 3 years from completion right here. It sounds like a gigantic project, and it is a gigantic project, but I always tell people if I could do it, you guys could do it. You start learning at the beginning, and by the end I don't know if you're smarter, but you know a lot more about tools and constructing things. This is the finished product right here. This is on the ground in Kelowna, British Columbia. When I go to Canada, I have to go in through a port of entry, and Kelowna happens to be the most convenient. It's about a 50-minute flight from concrete. Whenever I give talks like this, I always pay homage to aerial photographers that came before me, and there are many, but there are a few that stand out in particular. And this is in the Alps, and Eduardo Speltrini took this photograph from a balloon. And to me, that's sort of, you're at the mercy of a lot of kind of crappy mountain weather. And back then, I'm pretty sure they didn't have a clear idea of what was going on at, say, 12,000 feet plus, which is what this is undoubtedly. So we honor the courage of people like this who took a big chance, in my opinion. And then in a little more modern era, Bradford Washburn, the pioneering aerial photographer, particularly in Alaska, who went on to become the curator of the Boston Museum. later on. He photographed mountains all over the world, but when he started, this is the kind of thing he was doing. And he's holding a military surveillance camera that probably weighs about 65 pounds. And of course, up in Alaska, you know, he's dressed for cold weather. I think in this case, they probably took a window out of the airplane so that he could photograph not through glass. And then Austin Post, the great photographer for the Geological Survey, who photographed glaciers all over North America, Alaska, the US, Canada, and so on. I was fortunate to meet him when he was in his 80s, and I flew with him a number of times. We became friends. He's passed away now, but he's sitting here with a Fairchild military surveillance camera that he modified himself. This came out of World War II or maybe Korea, and it was made to take 9-inch roll film, which was in short supply, and so he modified it to accommodate 7-inch roll film. He was an amateur machinist. He never graduated from high school, but he went on to get an honorary PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks for what he did. And one of the conditions for that degree was they had some rule up there that you had to be a high school graduate. So they sent a letter to Chelan High School, where he was from, and the principal there wrote him out a diploma. And that's how he got to be a PhD. Flying in the mountains, there's, you know, it's a serious deal, and this ad right here kind of makes light of it a little bit, as if you could fly into the Glacier Peak Wilderness just to go skiing in a little rag and tube airplane like that. That plane, Bill Fairchild was Austin Post's one of his favorite pilots. He was a civilian. Austin flew in many different kinds of aircraft, but this one in particular he flew in many times. So here's the ad, and here's the reality. It's just, this is on the South Cascade Glacier, which is in the Glacier Peak Wilderness, but it's one of the most studied glaciers in Washington, well, actually in the lower 48. And Bill Fairchild had a wild hair, obviously, and so that's him standing there behind the plane, and they would have to lift the tail of the plane up and turn it to go back the other direction to fly out of there. This is pretty marginal in my opinion, because I know that airplane has a, you know, just to haul two big people like those two guys is kind of putting it at the edge. That airplane's still flying to this day somewhere in Indiana or something like that. I've actually communicated with the guy that owns it. Same airplane, same pilot. This is taking off from the IGY station in the Olympics, which is on a thing called Snow Dome. The airplane's coming down from Snow Dome, probably flying back to Port Angeles. In the back is the Blue Glacier, one of the large famous glaciers in the Olympic National Park. And of course you could get this kind of a thing where they were flying a woman into the IGY station. IGY is International Geophysical Year, I think. She was a scientist going to spend some time up there, and due to flat light and poor conditions, didn't see a big crevasse in the glacier and ended up in the glacier. And now they're trying to use a plank to drag the airplane out. She supposedly said afterwards that she thought all flights up to that station ended that way because she didn't fly. And then my reality is kind of like this. This is kind of pushing it for me, and I just wanted to show this picture because I take it very seriously. This was back from December of 2006, and that's Mount Waddington again, the picture the mountain that was in the on the title page. And when I see this kind of a thing, especially up there, you know, big gigantic mountains facing massive weather that's 1,000 miles wide, you just know the wind blowing across that thing is probably going about 60 or 80 miles an hour. So you have to be very careful and make decisions about whether or not you want to keep going, what you should do if you're there, where you can go and where you can't go. I'll get into that a little bit. But even back then, I had enough experience to know where to go and not to go. I basically started in 2002. And I've had some interesting experiences where the airplane's flipped up on its wing or, you know, pointed down. And I'm very wary of turbulence. But here's what happens when you're just patient sometimes. And so Mount Waddington, the clouds parted for about 5 minutes, and That's what I saw, and fortunately I had a camera in my hand. But I have a few little rules that I live by, and I've had the common sense to not get too greedy. It's what I always tell myself. Learned over many years and being cautious along the way. I didn't build this airplane to set out to do aerial photography, but because I was a climber and I was also obsessed with climbing guides and mountain books and so on, I was an amateur photographer. It just kind of went hand in hand. And so almost the minute I started flying the airplane, I started taking pictures with a little film camera. And this is one of the first photos I ever took. It was out of a little, I think it was a Canon little point and shoot film camera. This was in 2001, late 2001. But I did switch to digital right away when the film camera broke. And this is out of a 4 megapixel camera. And I put this in because this was the first photograph that I sent to the Geological Survey down at the Volcano Observatory in Vancouver. And the scientist there, Kevin Scott, who's retired now, is a renowned expert on lahars and landslides and mountain disasters, more or less. And it was this image that kind of launched our collaboration and our friendship, which continues to this day. And then through Kevin Scott and one of his colleagues, Carolyn Dreger down there, another scientist, that's how I met Austin Post. And through Austin Post, I met a guy in Seattle named John Roper, who's a renowned climber, who's climbed many, many summits in the North Cascades, and he's a climbing historian. And this photograph of the west face of North Hosamine, up by head of Ross Lake, is an example of an image that sort of launched my interaction with climbers and skiers. Roper was kind of egging me on to photograph big unclimbed stuff in the North Cascades, and at the time this was one of them. And he described that as having sword swishes from Zorro, so we called it the Zorro Face. And that name somehow made it into the climbing lexicon, and it stuck. I always thought you had to, like an act of Congress to name something. Well, no. You know, if you just call it that thing enough times, then pretty soon other people will call it too. Just getting back to that earlier slide I showed you. It's very good idea to have a great suspicion about what's going on up there, even if it's clear. And I always just kind of nibble away at the edges. And I flew this morning down to the Alpine Lakes Wilderness to photograph something. And I don't know about up here, but down there the wind is blowing out of the northeast. You know, the classic high pressure northeasterly. And sometimes in the mountains that can be pretty vicious. And so when I climbed up from Concrete's airport where I keep my plane, I could feel turbulence passing through, 4,000 or 5,000 feet. So that right there is suspicious. And when I got down to the Alpine Lakes, which are big mountains, I had to go down to do the photography to a lower altitude. And I just nibble at it because I'm really concerned that, I'm going to run into some really rough turbulence up there. I'm not perfect, and I have made some bad calls on occasion, but I always try to learn from them. I made a night landing in Concrete one time which is unlit airport, because I'd made a miscalculation on the distance to get back and the time and so on. And I'd already landed at the airport thousands of times, literally, and that kind of experience is what, saved me from a bad outcome. Stuff like that makes you sit down and do some self-examination, believe me. It's no place for, an attitude or being cocky or anything like that. I sought out counsel from a friend of mine who's a airline pilot with many thousands of hours of experience, and he's got white hair, and he said, "Why, this hair is white for a reason." And he told me all his mistakes, so. Sometimes the wind in the mountains is visualized. Here is Glacier Peak on the right with an enormous lenticular cloud, or a cloud cap as you'll hear it's called. That's a product of the wind blowing up and being raised in elevation and the moisture becoming visible. And then it goes over and down the other side. And these kind of fluffy clouds you see under it right there, that's a sign of really severe turbulence. So in a situation like this, from experience, you can fly around upwind of it all day long, or even above it. But to go around through that area would be foolhardy, I would say. I did a number of flights years ago with a friend of mine, a climber and photographer, Steph Abig. And she's working on a PhD in math right now at Colorado State or someplace like that, and she's very analytical, and she would compulsively make all these maps. So here's a map of Mount Rainier from a flight we did, where you can see at the top a couple places where we're inside that zone of terrible turbulence. And you notice there's no photographs. The red dots are photographic locations. And then you see how the general flight path is more of a horseshoe shape around the outsides of that. But then there is above the mountain where you can fly around. So this is what it was like that day, just at a lower altitude. And you can see Mount Adams in the back left there. But here's a hurricane blowing around Mount Rainier. And flying out downwind of that is, at the very minimum, uncomfortable, if not flat out dangerous. But you can fly above the mountain and be in smooth air. That's Mount St. Helens in the background. I have just a few pictures to show you from the Glacier project, which went from 2011 until 2018. It started out small, just the North Cascades, but it gradually evolved. I was sponsored largely by a scientist at Portland State University, Andrew Fountain, but it was also funded by the Geological Survey, Colorado State, Park Service, just a bunch of stuff like that. But this is in Wyoming. This is 2 glaciers in the Wind River Range. The big one on the left is called the Mammoth Glacier, and then the little one on the right is the Baby Glacier. Down there, the Forest Service also does a lot of glacier monitoring, where they go out on the glacier and they put survey stakes and they're measuring the ice volume and so on. And the type of photography has to be done late in the year, so there's absolutely no snow, so the scientists that are studying these things can see the margins of the ice. Glacier National Park, I photographed all the glaciers there twice. This one's from 2009. This is the Crowfoot Glacier. This is an example of how the terminal moraines and the lateral moraines can be used by the scientists to sort of paint a picture of the history of advance and recession of glaciers. This is in the crazy mountains of central Montana, and believe it or not, that's a glacier right there in the middle called the Grasshopper Glacier. It probably has ice under all that rubble, but you'd have to do ground proofing to, you can't really tell anything from the air other than you're photographing a spot where there's a named glacier. This is in the Absaroka Mountains of Wyoming. And the database shows the glacier to be that thing in the middle, that kind of series of little snowfields. And when I'm out there photographing it, I fly to this spot, and I can see the spot on the map, and I'm looking at the spot, but it sure doesn't really look like a glacier, whereas that snowfield to the right looks more like a glacier. But so when you're in places like this, you just kind of blanket it with photographs and hope you get the right thing. And of course, the further south you go, the more pathetic, for lack of a better word, they get. This is in the Sierra Blanca Massif of southern Colorado. This required a flight from Steamboat Springs all the way to southern Colorado and over kind of into the vicinity of Telluride. Basically a gigantic circumnavigation of the state of Colorado just for this. We've also done a lot of avalanche photography for the Department of Transportation, and I think many of you are probably familiar with this location. This is early in the season, but the Highway Department has all these avalanche chutes named and labeled and so on, and so for a project like this, I would start either on the west or the east, where the last known avalanche path is, and just fly up the highway photographing everything on both sides of the highway. This helps them update their atlases of of the shoots. Like at Stevens, they were relying on photographs that were probably taken in the early 70s, kind of crappy quality film when I went and did that one. I don't very often see anything out there that gives a sense of scale. This is on the Homathko ice field south of the Waddington range. If you look carefully in sort of the upper left center, you can see Waddington sticking up there in the distance. And a friend of mine from Vancouver, John Baldwin, who's a renowned skier of the Coast Mountains, pointed out to me that this was actually 3 kilometers long. But there's nothing out there to give any indication of that. Here's a chance encounter on the North Ridge of Baker with 3 climbers, which really gives you the sense of the magnificence of that terrain that you sometimes don't get from the air. And another Baker shot. This is actually Colfax, but that is the normal climbing route on Baker. I'm assuming you guys, some of you have climbed Baker from time to time. It cuts from kind of lower right to upper left there, and there's actually a group of climbers in there in that photograph. And here's a detail, you can see them. They're walking, you know, they had, this happened before they were there, of course, but they had, you know, the path goes right directly underneath that ice fall on the north side of Colfax. So if it was me, I would probably run that stretch if I could run it. This is a little video clip from the crater on Mount Baker. And that slope, let's see, it's kind of hard to tell, but this is Sherman Crater. The lower center fumaroles are called the sulfur cones fumaroles, and that slope that's sort of to the left going up to the top of Sherman Peak is a wind deposition slope. In the winter, the storms howl through the crater from the distance this direction, and it just loads that slope up with snow. And periodically, every 2 to 5 years, it comes off in a big, huge avalanche that goes down the Boulder Glacier. And I photographed that thing probably 5 times over the years. Dave Tucker's not here, but he kindly stood and allowed me to take this picture when we were in there in the crater one time helping out with a research project. And the slope that slides is that lefterly sort of upper skyline. And let's see, I hope this will play. It's supposed to. Okay, we don't seem to have any sound, but that's all right. That's a seismograph from it. If you watch carefully, you'll see the shadow of the airplane go across Sherman Peak. Yeah, right there you can see it in the lower part of the picture. If we could fix the sound, that'd be great. I'm not sure how to do that.
This is not the video you had before.
There's a different video where there is sound embedded there. That's okay. We'll just wait and we'll wait and see on the last one. These are just a series of pictures. There you can see the scar. That's probably a 100-foot scarp at the top. This went down about 1.25 miles on the glacier. There was a group of Knowles students at the bottom when it fell, and they thought they were doomed, but it stopped short of them by about 1/4 mile. Okay, let's see here. I want to move along and just show you a series of photographs, black and whites, monochromes from my travels over the years. And we're going to start off generally in the south and move to the north. And this is the east face of Mount Whitney in California. This was taken from a project in 2011, to photograph all the glaciers in the Sierra Nevada range down in California. There's actually a glacier underneath that rubble heap at the bottom of the face there, just not unlike the crazy mountains. I spent a lot of time around the volcanoes of the Cascades. This is Mount Shasta with Shastina, its little parasite cone in the right foreground there. Mount Lassen's out there somewhere. It's actually visible but blocked by Shasta here. That night landing I was telling you about was a project we did to photograph all the glaciers, all the volcanoes in the Cascades in one day. Well, it included part of the night, unfortunately. was looking across what's called the Yoakum Ridge on the west side of Mount Hood, down towards Mount Jefferson with the Three Sisters in the kind of upper left distance. Yoakum Ridge is a famous climbing route on Mount Hood. And Mount Adams, this is a flight that was done to gather photographs for an article in a magazine. I photographed a lot of fire lookouts. When you're out in remote places and you see a structure, it's really compelling. It's a sign of humanity that you don't often see out there. This particular one is the Slate Peak Fire Lookout. Have any of you been there before? It's supposed to be the highest drivable road in the state of Washington. The road goes to within about a quarter mile of it. You park and walk up the last little bit. It's right on the edge of the Pasayten Wilderness. So the photograph looks north into the Pasayten Wilderness. Not the leftmost mountain, but the sort of the upper left center one with a little cloud coming off of it is Mount Lego, named for Logie Wernstedt, the great Forest Service surveyor of the Pasayten and the earliest aerial photographer in the North Cascades. Sometimes you just get images by chance, and this is one of those. I was on my way down to the Skykomish area to photograph something early one morning here back in June, I think it was. Just flying along, mind my own business, and you look out and you see this, and it's like, well, that's pretty cool. A lot of, well, not a lot, but some of the big climbing related stuff I've photographed have been in the course of the Glacier project, and this was from last year. That giant pillar that's at center is called the Merlon, M-E-R-L-O-N, and it's a feature that stands right next to a mountain in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming called Cloud Peak. And that little glacier that's peeking out there at right center, that's the Cloud Peak Glacier. That was the last glacier in the project. But the Merlon itself, that face you see rising up there, is a big climbing objective, although very few people go to the Bighorn Mountains for climbing. And then in Colorado, Long's Peak, the east face, which is a great climbing objective. And believe it or not, that's a glacier down at the bottom of it. Mount Kinnerly in Glacier National Park. Everything you see there, with the exception of those snowfields that are sort of up in that gully at center, that stuff is all glacial. To the left is called the Agassiz Glacier. That's just one small part of it. But historical photographs show this big glorious glacier, and now it's pretty much fragments scattered across the slope. Because of my interest in climbing, I have photographed many things that are climbing related. That's really been one of my focuses, climbing and skiing. And this is in the Bugaboos, that's Bugaboo Spire, in the, let's see, how do you describe it? If you look at a map of British Columbia, you see what's called the Rocky Mountain Trench, which is a huge rift valley that runs all the way almost from the Northwest Territories down into the United States. And if you're looking at it, to the right are the Canadian Rockies, and to the left are the Columbia Mountains, which includes the Selkirks and so on. And the Bugaboos are part of that, the Columbia Mountains. People that drive like through that area would think they're always in the Rockies, but the fact is they're not. They're in one distinctly separate group of mountains. But the Bugaboos in particular are really a famed climbing destination. And in the Purcells, which is another part of the Columbia Mountains, you have mountains like this, Sir Sanford. It's the largest mountain in Canada in the Columbia Mountains side of it. And then at right center is the Adamant Range. And then to the far right, you're actually looking across the trench up into the Hooker Ice Field, which is one of the big ice fields in the Canadian Rockies. I'm a real big fan of remote stuff, and this is south of Prince George, the Lund Ice Field. I highly doubt anybody goes in here. It doesn't have a big alpine objective, but for skiers, backcountry skiers skiing across it, I'm sure that they would not see another soul while they're up there. They'd probably have to go in by helicopter. I photographed most of the Coast Mountains. This is on the White Mantle Range, just south of Mount Waddington. The big thing right in the front there doesn't have a name, but the mountain in the back is called Pilot Peak. This is so overshadowed by Waddington in that area that I don't, there's people like Baldwin that go through here on skis and explore the whole thing, but very few people go here. That mountain at the right is Mount Grenville, which is the tallest peak on the Hamatco ice field. And that's a glacier called the Elliott Glacier, which spills off of the main body of the Hamatco. I photographed a group of British skiers on here one time who had come here to do a big trip because it was way cheaper than going to the Arctic, and plus there's no polar bears here. And another view of Mount Waddington. This is kind of looking northwesterly, just a magnificent mountain. This photograph is from significantly further north in the Coast Mountains. This is Burkett Needle there in the front, and in the upper center there in the back is Devil's Thumb. You can't really see so well here, but the northwest face, which is the shadowy face that has the dark on the top of it, that's the tallest unclimbed face in North America. It gets close to 7,000 feet tall. The last people to try it, and I think it was 2003, two of them disappeared. One guy made the choice not to go on and turned back, and then the other two were never found. It's not a very tall mountain in some. I think it's less than 8,000 feet tall, but it rises almost from sea level. There's giant glaciers all around it, but it just has a tremendous relief that goes up. And when you see a place like this full of glaciers just draped everywhere, it's because the weather sucks most of the time. It's constantly precipitating, but it's way at a northerly latitude, and so you have what you might imagine the last ice age looked like, concentrated in this one area. This image is what I consider to be about the best I can do under really difficult circumstances, namely extreme remoteness, shot more or less straight towards the sun, no reflections or glare, sharp from left to right. Now, for the last part of this, I want to show you just some photographs from the Rockies, because I'm very fond of the Rockies, the Canadian Rockies. I've traveled there on foot many times. I've climbed some there, not a lot, but some, and flown almost from one end of it to the other. And this is Mount Assiniboine in the southern Rockies. Mount Brazo. I was on a kick to photograph all the peaks in the Rockies that were taller than 11,000 feet. I know they're all metric up there, but for some reason there's this group on Facebook. There's a group called the 11,000ers of the Canadian Rockies. They're all Canadian, but they're all not metric. But there is sort of a definitive book out there that's out of print now called the 11,000 Footers of the Canadian Rockies, and so that's sort of their Bible. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could photograph them all. And I photographed most of them, but not quite all of them. This looks across. This is near Moline Lake, if you've been up there. It's sort of south of Jasper, kind of the easterly part of the mountains where the glaciers are, in spite of what it looks like, maybe not so big. But in the background left, you see the Columbia ice field, which is probably the most famous big ice field up there. And then to the left of that, you'll see Mount Athabasca and Mount Andromeda. Athabasca, if you drive up there just in a car trip, you can basically drive right to the toe of that glacier that's coming off the Columbia ice field. The place is overrun with tourists, but for a reason, and the reason is because it's so spectacular. And if you ever get a chance to travel up there, I highly recommend it. This is on the Columbia ice field itself, Mount Columbia, so-called triple point of the North American continent, where waters from this region drain to the Pacific, the Atlantic, and then also into the Arctic Ocean through big rivers like the Mackenzie and the Saskatchewan and so on. And the great lord of the Rockies, Mount Robson. At center right there, this huge face is called the Emperor Face, and then the ridge running up to the summit above that is called the Emperor Ridge. This is a really fabled mountain. That face there, the north face, has been skied twice. And But I always tell people, you know, that sure, that's been skied twice, but this has not been skied yet. So there's an opportunity. Just last September, I was up there and I took this photograph of the North Twin and Twins Tower, looking south to the Lyell ice field, and to the left there in the distance, Mount Forbes, one of the great peaks up there. I love the photograph, but it's also kind of deceiving because what it doesn't show is this. That face there, the north face of Twins Tower, has been climbed 3 or 4 times, one of the hardest climbs on the continent. The first ascent, I think, took 4.5 days. And then, because as I've mentioned, I do have my own set of obsessions, and in September I made it up to a thing I'd been thinking about for a long time. This is in the Northwest Territories of Canada. It's called the Cirque of the Unclimbables. I have a couple photographs. This is, let's see. This peak, the name is just on the tip of my tongue and I can't think of it. But anyway, in the right background, you see the more famous mountain. It's just got some light on it. The Lotus Flower Tower, which was featured in a book that was called 50 Classic Climbs of North America. And that's what attracted me to this area. And so I did a trip from Valemount, which is near Mount Robson, where I've based many times, all in one day up here. And back. And it's a little over 2,400 kilometers in one day with 2 stops for fuel. And in Fort Nelson, where I stopped twice for fuel, out to this place is over 600-mile round trip. So when I do something like this, I have about 20 minutes to circle this twice and take photographs before I have to basically head straight back. Lotus Flower Tower is this one right here. The one in the center is called Tathagata. It's another gigantic face. And then on the right, Parrot Beak Peak. This is out there, in my opinion. It's so far north that the season is very short. I mean, this is early September and it's already got snow on it. And it's probably got a lot of snow on it now. I'm going to finish with 2 color photographs from the North Cascades, because I'm very fond of the North Cascades, as I'm sure all of you are. Mount Shuckson, and a view looking towards Baker across the southern Picket Range in North Cascades National Park. I'm not getting any younger, I'll say that. I do have a short video I want to show you. Okay, don't get too loud there.